A grey morning, fine drizzle hitting the courthouse steps. An obstinate prosecutor crosses empty corridors and enters the almost deserted room. At the defense table, the defendant stares at the floor. Beside him, a German shepherd authorized by the judge. Without haste, the prosecutor fires short questions, clearing the way for the blow. The dog rises, steps forward, and stares at the witness. The air becomes heavy. The prosecutor moves away from the pulpit, drops the paper on the counter, and steps back 2 paces. The defense asks for access. The raised document trembles. The dog takes 1 more step forward. Murmurs explode. And for a second, everything stopped. Do you love stories with animals? Then subscribe now and don't miss any. Thanks for joining us. Now, we return to our story. The Burlington County Courthouse buzzed with an unusual energy that Tuesday morning. Reporters clustered outside the imposing brick building, their cameras ready to capture what many believed would be just another routine fraud trial. Inside, the courtroom filled with curious onlookers, some drawn by the sensational headlines that had dominated local news for weeks, others simply seeking entertainment during their lunch breaks. Michael Thompson sat rigidly at the defendant's table, his weathered hands clasped tightly in front of him. At 42, the former construction foreman carried himself with the dignity of a man who had worked hard his entire life. But the weight of the accusations against him had aged him considerably in recent months. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, and his only good suit, pressed carefully that morning by his wife, hung loosely on his frame. He had lost weight since the charges were filed. Beside him lay Rex, a magnificent German shepherd whose presence had sparked heated debates among the legal community. The dog's thick coat gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and his intelligent amber eyes surveyed the room with calm alertness. Judge Patricia Reynolds had spent considerable time reviewing precedents before allowing Rex to remain in the courtroom as Michael's emotional support animal, a decision that had drawn criticism from some quarters but had ultimately been upheld after extensive psychological evaluations. District Attorney Richard Coleman adjusted his silk tie as he reviewed his notes one final time. At 38, he possessed the sharp features and calculating gaze of a man determined to climb the political ladder at any cost. His reputation for securing convictions had made him a local celebrity, and whispers of a potential run for state attorney general followed him wherever he went. This case, with its media attention and clear-cut evidence, would be another stepping stone toward his ultimate ambitions. The charges against Michael were serious. Embezzlement of construction funds, fraudulent billing practices, and conspiracy to defraud the Burlington School District. The prosecution alleged that Michael had systematically stolen over $200,000 during the renovation of Lincoln Elementary School, money that had been earmarked for improving educational facilities for underprivileged children. It was the kind of case that generated public outrage and demanded justice. Sarah Mitchell, Michael's defense attorney, organized her papers with practiced efficiency. At 45, she had built a reputation as a fierce advocate for the underdog, taking on cases that other lawyers avoided. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a professional bun, and her no-nonsense demeanor commanded respect in the courtroom. She had known Michael for years through community involvement, and when he had been charged, she had agreed to represent him, despite knowing it would be an uphill battle. The prosecution's case seemed airtight. They had documentation showing discrepancies in billing, testimony from subcontractors claiming they had been pressured to inflate invoices, and most damaging of all, a star witness who claimed to have direct knowledge of Michael's fraudulent activities. Jennifer Walsh, the former project coordinator, had come forward with detailed accounts of how Michael had orchestrated the entire scheme. As the morning progressed, the courtroom filled to capacity. The 12 jurors, carefully selected over the previous week, represented a cross-section of Burlington's community. There was Martha Henderson, a retired teacher whose stern expression suggested she took the allegations against someone who would steal from schools very seriously. James Cooper, a local mechanic, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the formal proceedings. Dr. Patricia Evans, a pediatrician, studied Michael with clinical interest, while Robert Chang, an accountant, had already pulled out a small notebook to jot down important details. Judge Reynolds called the court to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel. The 60-year-old jurist commanded immediate respect, her silver hair pulled back severely and her black robes giving her an almost regal bearing. She had presided over Burlington County's most important cases for over 15 years, and her reputation for fairness was matched only by her intolerance for courtroom theatrics. Coleman rose to deliver his opening statement, his voice carrying the confidence of a prosecutor who believed he held all the cards. He painted a picture of systematic fraud, of a man who had betrayed the trust placed in him by the community. With dramatic flair, he described how Michael had allegedly created false invoices, paid phantom employees, and diverted funds intended for children's education into his own pockets. The prosecution's narrative was compelling and seemingly watertight. Coleman presented bank records, purchase orders, and a timeline of events that appeared to leave no room for doubt. The jurors listened intently, several of them occasionally glancing at Michael with expressions that ranged from disappointment to outright disgust. Rex remained perfectly still throughout Coleman's presentation, his head resting on his front paws, occasionally lifting his ears at sudden sounds, but otherwise maintaining the calm demeanor that had impressed the court-appointed animal behaviorist during the pre-trial hearings. Sarah Mitchell's opening statement took a different approach. Rather than attempting to immediately counter every prosecution claim, she focused on Michael's character and his 20-year history of honest work in the community. She reminded the jury that accusations were not proof, and that the burden of proof rested entirely with the prosecution. Her voice carried conviction as she described Michael as a man who had built playgrounds for free, who had donated materials and labor to help elderly residents repair their homes, and who had never once been accused of any wrongdoing in his 2 decades of construction work. She painted a picture of a hard-working family man who had been caught in circumstances beyond his control. The first witness called by the prosecution was David Martinez, the school district's facilities manager. His testimony established the timeline of the Lincoln Elementary renovation project and provided context for the financial irregularities that had allegedly taken place. Martinez appeared nervous as he described the discovery of discrepancies in the project's final accounting, glancing occasionally at Michael with what seemed like regret. As the morning wore on, additional witnesses painted a picture of a construction project that had spiraled out of control. Subcontractors testified about change orders that seemed excessive, about requests for materials that never appeared on the job site, and about cash payments that circumvented normal billing procedures. Throughout these testimonies, Rex remained alert but calm, occasionally shifting position but never causing disruption. The dog's presence had initially seemed unusual to the court personnel, but his perfect behavior was gradually being accepted as normal by everyone present. The courtroom atmosphere grew increasingly tense as lunch break approached. Coleman's case was building systematically, each witness adding another layer to the prosecution's narrative of fraud and deception. The circumstantial evidence was mounting, and several jurors were taking extensive notes. Michael's face remained stoic, but Sarah noticed the slight tremor in his hands and the way his jaw clenched whenever particularly damaging testimony was presented. She had counseled him extensively about maintaining composure, knowing that any sign of guilt or desperation could influence the jury's perception. As Judge Reynolds announced the lunch recess, the courtroom slowly emptied. Rex stretched and looked up at Michael with those intelligent eyes that seemed to understand far more than a typical pet would. The afternoon would bring the prosecution's star witness, and everyone in the courtroom sensed that Jennifer Walsh's testimony would likely determine Michael Thompson's fate. Jennifer Walsh entered the courtroom with the confident stride of someone who believed she held the key to justice. At 34, she possessed the polished appearance of a seasoned professional, her blonde hair styled in a sleek bob, and her navy blue suit impeccably tailored. As the former project coordinator for the Lincoln Elementary renovation, she had worked closely with Michael Thompson for 8 months, giving her testimony particular weight in the eyes of the prosecution. The afternoon session resumed with a packed courtroom, word having spread during lunch that the star witness would be taking the stand. Coleman approached the witness stand with visible satisfaction, knowing that Jennifer's testimony would likely seal Michael's conviction. He had spent weeks preparing her for this moment, reviewing every detail of her account until it flowed seamlessly. Jennifer raised her right hand and swore to tell the truth, her voice clear and steady. She settled into the witness chair with composure, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she looked directly at the jury. The 12 men and women studied her intently, clearly recognizing the importance of what they were about to hear. Rex lay quietly beside the defendant's table, but Sarah Mitchell noticed that the dog's ears had perked up slightly when Jennifer entered the room. The German Shepherd's amber eyes followed the witness's movements with what seemed like unusual interest, though he remained perfectly still. Coleman began his examination by establishing Jennifer's credentials and her relationship to the case. She spoke articulately about her educational background in project management and her 5-year tenure with the school district. Her responses were precise and professional, creating an immediate impression of competence and reliability. The prosecutor then guided Jennifer through the timeline of the Lincoln Elementary project, from the initial planning stages through the discovery of the financial irregularities. She described her working relationship with Michael in terms that suggested initial trust that had gradually eroded as suspicious patterns emerged. Jennifer's testimony painted Michael as a man who had slowly drawn her into a web of fraudulent activities. According to her account, it had started with small requests to process invoices without proper documentation, supposedly to expedite payments to subcontractors who were facing financial hardships. She claimed that Michael had presented these requests as temporary measures to help fellow workers in the community. The courtroom hung on every word as Jennifer described how the schemes had allegedly escalated. She testified that Michael had asked her to create false purchase orders for materials that were never delivered, to approve payments to companies that existed only on paper, and to manipulate project timelines to justify cost overruns that went directly into accounts he controlled. Her delivery was flawless, each detail precisely remembered and convincingly presented. She described specific conversations, quoted dollar amounts with confidence, and provided dates and locations that could be verified. The jurors were clearly impressed by the thoroughness of her recollection and the apparent sincerity of her distress at having been manipulated. Martha Henderson, the retired teacher on the jury, nodded approvingly as Jennifer described her growing discomfort with the requests. Dr. Patricia Evans leaned forward in her seat, studying the witness's demeanor with professional interest. Even Robert Chang, the skeptical accountant, seemed convinced by the financial details that flowed so easily from Jennifer's testimony. Michael's face had grown pale as the accusations mounted. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on his arm, reminding him silently to maintain his composure, but she could feel the tension radiating from her client. This was worse than they had anticipated. Jennifer's testimony was not only damaging, but delivered with such conviction that it would be extremely difficult to challenge. As Jennifer continued her direct examination, she described the moment she claimed to have realized the full extent of the fraud. According to her testimony, she had discovered a pattern of duplicate payments to a subcontractor and had confronted Michael about it. She alleged that he had initially tried to dismiss her concerns, then had attempted to pressure her into remaining silent by suggesting that her own job might be at risk if the irregularities were discovered. The emotional impact of her testimony was evident throughout the courtroom. Jennifer's voice trembled slightly as she described her internal struggle between loyalty to Michael, whom she had considered a mentor, and her duty to protect the children who would suffer if school funds continued to be diverted. Several jurors appeared moved by her apparent anguish over the difficult position she claimed to have been placed in. Coleman was clearly pleased with how the testimony was unfolding. Each question he posed elicited responses that strengthened the prosecution's case, and Jennifer's credibility seemed unshakable. The circumstantial evidence that had been presented earlier in the day now had a human face and voice to give it meaning and context. It was at this crucial moment, as Jennifer was describing the alleged pressure she had faced from Michael, that Rex suddenly lifted his head. The German Shepherd had been lying quietly for hours, but something had clearly captured his attention. His ears were fully erect now, and his intelligent eyes were fixed intently on the witness stand. The movement was subtle, but several people in the courtroom noticed it. Sarah Mitchell felt her pulse quicken as she observed Rex's changed posture. The dog had undergone extensive training as an emotional support animal, and part of that training had involved learning to detect and respond to elevated stress levels and emotional distress in humans. Jennifer was in the middle of describing a particularly damaging conversation with Michael when Rex slowly rose to his feet. The dog's movement was deliberate and calm, but unmistakably purposeful. He began walking toward the witness stand with measured steps, his gaze never leaving Jennifer's face. A murmur rippled through the courtroom as people turned to watch the unusual scene unfolding. Judge Reynolds looked up from her notes, her expression curious but not yet concerned. Coleman paused in his questioning, momentarily distracted by the unexpected interruption. Rex stopped approximately 6 feet from the witness stand and sat down, his posture alert and his amber eyes fixed directly on Jennifer. The German Shepherd's gaze was steady and unwavering, creating an atmosphere of tension that seemed to fill the entire courtroom. Jennifer's composure faltered for the first time since taking the stand. Her eyes darted nervously between Rex and Coleman, and her previously steady voice developed a slight tremor. She cleared her throat and attempted to continue her testimony, but the words seemed to stick in her throat. The silence stretched uncomfortably as everyone in the courtroom watched the strange confrontation between woman and dog. Rex remained perfectly still, but his intense stare seemed to unsettle Jennifer in a way that hours of cross-examination might not have achieved. Judge Reynolds finally spoke, her voice cutting through the tension. She asked if there was a problem, and Coleman quickly objected to what he characterized as a deliberate distraction orchestrated by the defense. Sarah Mitchell rose to respond, pointing out that Rex had been specifically authorized as Michael's support animal and that his behavior was entirely natural and uncontrolled. The brief legal exchange did nothing to diminish the impact of what the jury had witnessed. Jennifer had gone from a confident, credible witness to someone who appeared visibly shaken by the simple presence of a dog. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass, and several jurors exchanged meaningful glances. Coleman attempted to regain control of his examination, but the momentum had been disrupted. Jennifer's responses became less fluid, her confidence clearly rattled by the unexpected encounter. When she tried to continue describing Michael's alleged misconduct, her voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. Rex finally returned to his position beside the defendant's table, but the damage had been done. The jury had witnessed something they couldn't easily explain or dismiss, and the seeds of doubt about Jennifer's testimony had been planted in their minds. Sarah Mitchell approached the witness stand with the calculated confidence of a defense attorney who had spotted weaknesses in what had initially appeared to be an unshakable testimony. The unusual interaction between Rex and Jennifer Walsh had created an opportunity, and Sarah intended to exploit it fully. The German Shepherd had returned to his resting position, but his earlier behavior had clearly rattled the prosecution's star witness. Jennifer shifted uncomfortably in her chair as Sarah began her cross-examination. The confidence that had characterized her direct testimony seemed diminished, replaced by a wariness that hadn't been there before. Her hands remained folded in her lap, but Sarah noticed the slight tension in her shoulders and the way her eyes occasionally darted toward where Rex lay beside Michael's table. Sarah's approach was methodical and patient. Rather than immediately attacking Jennifer's credibility, she began by asking seemingly innocuous questions about the witness's background and her tenure with the school district. Jennifer's responses were careful and measured, but they lacked the spontaneous confidence she had displayed earlier. The first significant inconsistency emerged when Sarah questioned Jennifer about her educational background. According to the prosecution's witness list, Jennifer held a degree in project management from the University of Vermont. However, when pressed for specific details about her coursework and graduation date, Jennifer's answers became vague and contradictory. Robert Chang, the accountant on the jury, leaned forward with increased interest. As someone familiar with professional credentials, he recognized the evasiveness in Jennifer's responses about her supposed expertise. Martha Henderson frowned slightly, her teacher's instincts detecting something amiss in the witness's suddenly uncertain demeanor. Sarah pressed further, asking Jennifer to describe specific project management methodologies she had supposedly learned during her university studies. Jennifer's responses revealed a superficial understanding that seemed inconsistent with someone who claimed to have formal training in the field. The contradiction was subtle but significant, planting seeds of doubt about the witness's overall credibility. Coleman objected several times during this line of questioning, claiming irrelevance, but Judge Reynolds allowed Sarah to continue exploring Jennifer's qualifications. The prosecutor's objections seemed defensive rather than procedural, and several jurors noted his apparent discomfort with the direction of the cross-examination. As Sarah delved deeper into Jennifer's work history, more inconsistencies began to emerge. Jennifer claimed to have worked on several major projects before the Lincoln Elementary renovation, but when asked for specific details about budgets, timelines, and outcomes, her knowledge proved surprisingly shallow. For someone who supposedly had 5 years of experience with the school district, she seemed remarkably uninformed about basic procedures and protocols. The cross-examination took a more pointed turn when Sarah began questioning Jennifer about her alleged interactions with Michael Thompson. Jennifer maintained her composure while describing the early stages of their working relationship, but her demeanor shifted noticeably when Sarah asked about specific conversations and meetings. Sarah pulled out a thick folder and began referencing project documents that hadn't been introduced during the direct examination. She asked Jennifer to identify her handwriting on various forms and requisitions, many of which contradicted the timeline of events presented in her testimony. Jennifer's responses became increasingly hesitant as she struggled to reconcile her sworn statements with the documentary evidence. The most damaging revelation came when Sarah presented a series of email communications between Jennifer and the school district's accounting department. The emails, dated several weeks before Jennifer claimed to have discovered the financial irregularities, showed her requesting detailed information about project accounting procedures and expressing concern about her own understanding of the billing processes. The implications were significant. If Jennifer had been as experienced and knowledgeable as she claimed, why would she need to request basic information about procedures she supposedly had been following for years? And if she had discovered the fraud when she claimed, why were the emails asking about accounting procedures sent before her alleged moment of discovery? Jennifer's explanation was unconvincing. She claimed the emails were part of routine quality assurance efforts, but her voice lacked conviction and her body language suggested discomfort with the questions. Rex, who had been lying quietly, lifted his head slightly and looked toward the witness stand, though he didn't rise from his position. The German Shepherd's renewed attention to Jennifer didn't go unnoticed by the jury. James Cooper, the mechanic, glanced between the dog and the witness with obvious curiosity. Dr. Patricia Evans was watching both Jennifer's verbal responses and her physiological reactions with clinical interest, noting the subtle signs of stress that were becoming increasingly apparent. Sarah's questioning became more aggressive as she explored the financial aspects of Jennifer's testimony. She presented Jennifer with copies of purchase orders and invoices that the witness claimed to have processed under Michael's direction. However, when asked to identify specific details about the vendors and services listed on these documents, Jennifer's knowledge proved superficial. The cross-examination revealed that Jennifer couldn't explain basic aspects of the construction industry, couldn't identify common materials and equipment referenced in the allegedly fraudulent documents, and seemed unfamiliar with standard practices that someone in her position should have understood thoroughly. Her earlier confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by visible anxiety and evasiveness. Coleman's objections became more frequent and strident as Sarah's questioning exposed these gaps in Jennifer's knowledge. The prosecutor's demeanor had changed noticeably since the lunch break, his earlier confidence replaced by barely concealed frustration. He frequently interrupted Sarah's flow of questions with procedural objections that seemed designed more to give Jennifer time to recover than to address legitimate legal concerns. Judge Reynolds was clearly noting Coleman's defensive posture. The experienced jurist had presided over hundreds of trials and could recognize when an attorney was struggling to protect a witness whose credibility was under attack. Her stern glances toward the prosecution table suggested her displeasure. With the constant interruptions, the afternoon wore on, with Sarah systematically dismantling Jennifer's testimony piece by piece. She presented evidence of Jennifer's financial difficulties, including recent applications for personal loans and credit extensions that suggested possible motivation for dishonest behavior. Jennifer's explanations for these financial pressures were weak and inconsistent. Perhaps most damaging was Sarah's revelation that Jennifer had been in contact with Coleman's office for weeks before officially coming forward as a witness. Phone records showed multiple lengthy conversations between Jennifer and prosecution staff, suggesting extensive coaching and preparation that went beyond normal witness preparation. When confronted with this evidence, Jennifer claimed the conversations were merely about scheduling and logistics. However, the frequency and duration of the calls suggested something far more extensive. The jury was clearly troubled by this revelation, and several members exchanged meaningful glances. As the day's testimony neared its end, Sarah presented one final piece of evidence that sent shockwaves through the courtroom. She produced a document that appeared to be a draft immunity agreement between Jennifer Walsh and the district attorney's office, dated several weeks before Jennifer's supposed decision to come forward as a witness. The document suggested that Jennifer had been negotiating for protection from prosecution in exchange for her testimony against Michael Thompson. If authentic, it would completely undermine her claim that she had come forward out of moral obligation and concern for the community. Coleman leaped to his feet with a vehement objection, claiming the document was privileged and inadmissible. However, his reaction seemed more desperate than legal, and the damage had already been done. The jury had seen enough to raise serious questions about Jennifer's motivation and credibility. Judge Reynolds called for a brief recess to consider the admissibility of the immunity agreement, but the impact on the courtroom atmosphere was already evident. The prosecution's seemingly airtight case had developed significant cracks, and Jennifer Walsh's credibility as the star witness had been severely compromised. As the participants filed out of the courtroom, Rex rose and stretched, his amber eyes once again focusing briefly on Jennifer as she hurried past the defendant's table. The German Shepherd's consistent reaction to the witness was becoming impossible to ignore, and even the most skeptical observers were beginning to wonder if the dog was detecting something that human instincts had missed. The following morning brought a palpable shift in the courtroom's atmosphere. News of the previous day's dramatic cross-examination had spread throughout Burlington, and the gallery was packed with curious spectators eager to witness what many now saw as a trial that was far from the foregone conclusion it had initially appeared to be. Local reporters had upgraded their coverage from routine court proceedings to front-page news, and the courthouse steps buzzed with activity as camera crews prepared for what they sensed would be significant developments. Jennifer Walsh returned to the witness stand with obvious reluctance, her confident demeanor from 2 days earlier completely absent. She had spent the evening with Coleman and his team, attempting to prepare for what promised to be a grueling continuation of Sarah Mitchell's cross-examination. The immunity agreement document that had surfaced the previous afternoon had created a crisis for the prosecution, forcing them to develop new strategies to salvage their case. Judge Reynolds had ruled during the morning's preliminary session that the immunity agreement would be admitted into evidence, despite Coleman's vigorous objections. The prosecutor's face had gone ashen when the ruling was announced, and whispered. Consultations with his staff had continued right up until the jury was brought back into the courtroom. Rex entered the courtroom with his usual calm dignity, but Sarah noticed that the German Shepherd's attention immediately focused on Jennifer as she took her place at the witness stand. The dog's behavior had become a source of intense speculation among court observers, with some dismissing it as coincidence, while others began to wonder if there might be something more significant at play. Sarah resumed her cross-examination by addressing the immunity agreement directly. The document, now formally entered as Defense Exhibit A, painted a very different picture of Jennifer's motivations than the one she had presented in her direct testimony. According to the agreement, Jennifer had approached the district attorney's office 3 months before the charges against Michael were filed, seeking protection from potential prosecution in exchange for her cooperation. The revelation was devastating to Jennifer's credibility. Her claim that she had come forward out of moral obligation was completely undermined by evidence that she had initiated contact with prosecutors while negotiating for her own protection. When Sarah asked her to explain this contradiction, Jennifer's responses were evasive and unconvincing. Jennifer claimed that she had sought legal advice because she was afraid of potential retaliation from Michael, but the timeline didn't support her explanation. The immunity negotiations had begun before Jennifer claimed to have discovered the full extent of the alleged fraud, suggesting that her knowledge of wrongdoing was much more extensive and personal than she had admitted. As Sarah pressed for More details about Jennifer's interactions with the prosecution, it became clear that the witness had been far more involved in developing the case against Michael than anyone had realized. Phone records showed dozens of calls between Jennifer and Coleman's office, many lasting over an hour, suggesting extensive collaboration in building the prosecution's narrative. The jury was clearly troubled by these revelations. Martha Henderson's expression had grown increasingly stern as Jennifer's deceptions became apparent. Robert Chang was taking detailed notes, his accountant's precision capturing every inconsistency and contradiction. Even James Cooper, who had initially seemed impressed by Jennifer's testimony, now watched her with obvious skepticism. Dr. Patricia Evans observed Jennifer's physiological responses with professional interest. The witness was displaying classic signs of stress and deception: rapid breathing, increased blinking, defensive posturing, and micro-expressions that contradicted her verbal statements. The pediatrician's training in reading nonverbal cues made Jennifer's discomfort impossible to miss. Rex's behavior continued to correlate with the most problematic moments in Jennifer's testimony. Whenever she attempted to deflect difficult questions or provide explanations that seemed particularly implausible, the German Shepherd would lift his head and focus his attention on the witness stand. The pattern was becoming too consistent to be coincidental. Sarah introduced additional evidence that further undermined Jennifer's credibility. Bank records showed that Jennifer had received several large cash deposits in the months leading up to her decision to cooperate with prosecutors. When asked to explain the source of these deposits, Jennifer claimed they were loans from family members, but she couldn't provide documentation to support her explanation. The cross-examination revealed that Jennifer's financial situation was far more precarious than she had initially admitted. She owed significant amounts on credit cards, had defaulted on a car loan, and was facing potential eviction from her apartment. The immunity agreement wasn't just about avoiding prosecution for her alleged involvement in Michael's supposed schemes. It also included provisions for witness protection payments that would have resolved her immediate financial crisis. Coleman's objections became increasingly desperate as Sarah methodically destroyed his star witness's credibility. The prosecutor was clearly unprepared for the depth of Jennifer's deception and the extent to which her testimony could be contradicted by documentary evidence. His earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by visible anxiety and frequent consultations with his staff. The most damaging revelation came when Sarah presented evidence that Jennifer had been involved in similar financial irregularities at her previous job with a private construction company. Court records showed that she had been quietly terminated from that position following an internal investigation into missing funds, though no criminal charges had been filed. The pattern of behavior suggested that Jennifer's involvement in the Lincoln Elementary situation was far from the innocent victimization she had claimed. When confronted with this evidence, Jennifer's composure completely cracked. She attempted to explain away the previous incident as a misunderstanding, but her explanations were contradicted by personnel records and witness statements that Sarah had obtained from the previous employer. The jury could see that Jennifer had a history of financial misconduct that she had concealed from both the court and the prosecution. Rex rose from his position beside the defendant's table as Jennifer's testimony became increasingly frantic and contradictory. The German Shepherd walked slowly toward the witness stand, his movement deliberate and purposeful. Unlike his earlier approach, this time Rex stopped directly in front of the witness stand and sat down, his amber eyes fixed intently on Jennifer's face. The courtroom fell silent as the confrontation between woman and dog played out once again. Jennifer's voice caught in her throat as she attempted to continue her explanation, her eyes darting nervously between Rex and the jury. The German shepherd's unwavering gaze seemed to strip away her remaining composure, leaving her visibly shaken and defensive. Judge Reynolds called for a brief recess, ostensibly to allow Jennifer to compose herself. But the damage had been done. The jury had witnessed another unmistakable reaction from Rex during a moment when Jennifer appeared to be struggling with the truth. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore, and several jurors were clearly beginning to view the dog's behavior as significant. During the recess, Coleman approached Sarah with an unexpected proposal. The prosecutor suggested the possibility of plea negotiations, hinting that the charges against Michael might be reduced in exchange for a guilty plea to lesser offenses. Sarah's response was firm and immediate. Her client was innocent and would not accept any plea agreement that required an admission of guilt. The afternoon session brought additional witnesses for the defense, each one adding to the growing questions about the prosecution's case. Thomas Bradley, a former colleague of Jennifer's from the construction company where she had been terminated, testified about the financial irregularities that had led to her dismissal. His testimony painted Jennifer as someone who had used her position to manipulate billing and accounting procedures for personal gain. Bradley's testimony was particularly damaging because it established a clear pattern of behavior. According to his account, Jennifer had used the same techniques at her previous job that she was now claiming Michael had forced her to use at Lincoln Elementary. The suggestion that Jennifer was actually the architect of the fraudulent schemes rather than an unwilling participant was becoming increasingly credible. Additional character witnesses testified about Michael's integrity and community involvement. Pastor William Hayes from St. Mark's Episcopal Church described Michael's volunteer work helping elderly parishioners with home repairs. Lisa Rodriguez, director of the Burlington Youth Center, testified about Michael's donation of materials and labor to build a new playground. These witnesses painted a picture of a man whose character was completely inconsistent with the charges against him. As the day progressed, the momentum in the case had clearly shifted. What had begun as a seemingly straightforward prosecution had transformed into a complex web of deception and false accusations. Jennifer's credibility as the star witness had been thoroughly destroyed, and serious questions were being raised about the integrity of the entire case. Rex's behavior throughout the day had been remarkable in its consistency. The German shepherd seemed to possess an uncanny ability to detect moments of deception and stress, his reactions serving as a kind of biological lie detector that the jury couldn't ignore. His presence had transformed from an unusual accommodation for the defendant into a key factor in exposing the truth. The courtroom atmosphere as the day ended was electric with tension and anticipation. The prosecution's case was clearly in crisis, and Coleman's desperate attempts to salvage Jennifer's testimony had only made the situation worse. The community that had initially been outraged by Michael's alleged crimes was now beginning to wonder if they had been deceived by a far more complex and sinister scheme. The third day of the trial dawned with an intensity that seemed to permeate the very walls of the Burlington County Courthouse. Word had spread throughout the community that something extraordinary was unfolding in Judge Reynolds' courtroom, and the media presence had grown exponentially. National news outlets had begun picking up the story of the construction worker whose German shepherd appeared to be exposing lies in real time, turning what had started as a local fraud case into a phenomenon that captured public imagination. Across the country, Coleman arrived at court that morning looking haggard and desperate, his usual polished appearance replaced by the disheveled look of a man who had spent the night frantically trying to salvage a case that was rapidly disintegrating. His staff huddled around him in whispered consultations, their faces reflecting the gravity of their situation. The prosecutor, who had entered this trial expecting an easy victory, now faced the very real possibility of a devastating defeat that could end his political aspirations. Michael Thompson walked into the courtroom with Rex at his side, and for the first time since the trial began, there was a glimmer of hope in his demeanor. The weight of the accusations still pressed down on him, but the events of the previous days had begun to vindicate his consistent claims of innocence. Sarah Mitchell had worked tirelessly through the night, preparing for what she anticipated would be the most crucial day of the trial. Judge Reynolds called the court to order with an air of stern authority that suggested she was fully aware of the unusual circumstances surrounding the case. The experienced jurist had presided over many trials in her career, but she had never encountered a situation where an animal appeared to be playing such a significant role in exposing the truth. Her professional demeanor remained unchanged, but those who knew her well could detect a hint of fascination with the unprecedented developments. Coleman's first move was to recall Jennifer Walsh to the stand, despite the devastating damage to her credibility from the previous day's cross-examination. It was a desperate gambit, an attempt to allow her to explain away the inconsistencies and contradictions that had emerged. However, the decision would prove to be a critical mistake that would only accelerate the collapse of his case. Jennifer returned to the witness stand with obvious reluctance, her earlier confidence completely shattered. She had spent the evening in intense preparation sessions with the prosecution team, attempting to develop plausible explanations for the mountain of contradictory evidence that had been presented. Her appearance showed the strain of the past days, with dark circles under her eyes and a nervous tremor in her hands that hadn't been present at the beginning of her testimony. As Jennifer took her seat, Rex immediately lifted his head from his resting position. The German shepherd's amber eyes fixed on the witness with an intensity that had become familiar to everyone in the courtroom. The dog's consistent reaction to Jennifer's presence was no longer surprising, but it remained deeply unsettling to the witness and fascinating to the observers. Coleman began his redirect examination with questions designed to allow Jennifer to explain the immunity agreement and the financial records that had so damaged her credibility. However, her explanations were unconvincing and often contradictory, creating new problems rather than solving existing ones. The prosecutor's frustration was evident as each question seemed to dig the hole deeper rather than providing the rehabilitation he desperately needed. The situation deteriorated further when Coleman attempted to introduce a new piece of evidence, a document that allegedly showed Michael Thompson's signature on a fraudulent purchase order. The document had not been disclosed during the discovery process, and its sudden appearance raised immediate questions about its authenticity and the circumstances of its discovery. Sarah Mitchell's objection was immediate and vehement. She pointed out that the late disclosure of potentially crucial evidence violated discovery rules and suggested possible prosecutorial misconduct. Judge Reynolds sustained the objection and ordered a sidebar conference to address the irregular introduction of new evidence so late in the trial. The whispered conference at the bench revealed the desperate state of the prosecution's case. Coleman claimed that the document had only recently been discovered in a misfiled folder, but his explanation was weak and unconvincing. Sarah argued that the timing was highly suspicious and suggested that the document might be fabricated. Judge Reynolds' stern expression indicated her displeasure with the prosecution's handling of the evidence. When the sidebar concluded, Judge Reynolds announced that she would need to examine the document's authenticity before allowing its admission into evidence. The delay was another blow to Coleman's strategy and further undermined confidence in the prosecution's case. The jury could sense that something significant was happening, even though they couldn't hear the specific details of the legal dispute. During the lunch recess, Sarah's investigation into the mysterious document yielded shocking results. Her paralegal discovered that the paper bore a watermark that hadn't been used by the manufacturer until 6 months after the Lincoln Elementary project had been completed. The document was not only improperly disclosed, but was clearly fabricated, representing a serious ethical violation by the prosecution. The afternoon session opened with Sarah presenting her findings about the fraudulent document to Judge Reynolds. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom as the implications became clear. Not only was the prosecution's case built on unreliable witness testimony, but there was now evidence of possible document fabrication and prosecutorial misconduct. Coleman's face went ashen as Sarah methodically demonstrated the document's fraudulent nature. The watermark evidence was irrefutable, and the prosecutor's explanations were increasingly desperate and implausible. Judge Reynolds ordered an immediate investigation into the circumstances surrounding the document's creation and disclosure, effectively suspending that portion of the trial. The impact on Jennifer Walsh's testimony was immediate and devastating. If the prosecution was willing to fabricate evidence to support their case, what did that say about the reliability of their star witness? The jury's skeptical glances toward the prosecution table made their feelings clear, and several members were taking notes about the document controversy. Rex's behavior during this crisis was particularly noteworthy. As the tensions in the courtroom reached a fever pitch, the German Shepherd remained remarkably calm and alert. When Jennifer attempted to defend the prosecution's actions, claiming she had seen Michael sign the fraudulent document, Rex rose from his position and walked directly to the witness stand once again. This time, Rex's approach was different. Rather than simply sitting and staring at Jennifer, the dog began to exhibit signs of agitation that his handlers had trained him to display when detecting extreme emotional distress or deception. He paced briefly in front of the witness stand, his ears back and his posture tense, before sitting down and maintaining his intense focus on Jennifer. The courtroom was mesmerized by Rex's behavior. The German Shepherd's reaction was more pronounced than anything they had witnessed before, and even the most skeptical observers began to accept that the dog was detecting something significant in Jennifer's demeanor and responses. The pattern was too consistent and too precisely timed to be dismissed as coincidence. Jennifer's composure finally cracked under the combined pressure of the document controversy and Rex's unwavering attention. Her voice became shaky as she attempted to maintain her testimony, and her explanations became increasingly frantic and contradictory. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the courtroom's air conditioning, and her hands trembled visibly as she reached for her water glass. Sarah seized the opportunity to press her advantage. She presented additional evidence that she had been holding in reserve, financial records showing that Jennifer had received several large cash payments from an account linked to Coleman's campaign fund. The payments coincided exactly with key moments in the development of the case against Michael, strongly suggesting that Jennifer had been financially compensated for her testimony. The revelation was explosive. Not only was Jennifer's testimony unreliable, but there was now evidence that she had been paid to provide it. The ethical implications were staggering, and Coleman's denials were met with obvious skepticism from the jury and court personnel. Judge Reynolds' expression was thunderous as she processed the implications of what appeared to be witness tampering and bribery. As the evidence mounted against Jennifer and the prosecution, Rex's behavior became even more animated. The German Shepherd seemed to sense the climactic moment approaching. his training and natural instincts combining to create an almost supernatural awareness of the deception and corruption that was being exposed. His presence had evolved from an unusual accommodation to a key element in revealing the truth. The courtroom atmosphere was electric with tension and anticipation as the day's session neared its end. Jennifer Walsh sat slumped in the witness chair, her elaborate deception finally unraveling completely. Coleman faced the ruin of his career and possible criminal charges for his role in the fraudulent case. Michael Thompson, who had endured days of accusations and doubt, now saw vindication within reach. Judge Reynolds announced that the court would recess until the following morning to allow time for a thorough investigation of the prosecutorial misconduct allegations. As the participants filed out of the courtroom, Rex walked calmly beside Michael, his job as a detector of truth and guardian of justice nearly complete. The German Shepherd's remarkable performance had helped expose one of the most elaborate, fraudulent prosecutions in Burlington County's history, setting the stage for a dramatic conclusion that would restore faith in the justice system and vindicate an innocent man. The final day of the trial arrived with an atmosphere so charged with anticipation that it seemed to crackle in the air around the Burlington County Courthouse. National media outlets had descended on the small Vermont community, transforming the quiet courthouse steps into a circus of reporters, cameras, and curious onlookers. The story of Michael Thompson and Rex the German Shepherd had captured the nation's imagination, becoming a symbol of truth prevailing over corruption and deception. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Judge Reynolds had spent the evening reviewing the evidence of prosecutorial misconduct and document fabrication that had emerged during the previous day's proceedings. Her expression as she took the bench conveyed the gravity of the situation and her determination to see justice served, regardless of the consequences for those who had attempted to pervert it. Michael Thompson entered the courtroom with Rex by his side, walking with a dignity that had been tested but never broken throughout the ordeal. The man who had been painted as a criminal and fraud was now recognized by many as the victim of an elaborate scheme to destroy his reputation and freedom. The community support that had gradually built around him was evident in the packed gallery, where friends, neighbors, and even strangers had come to witness what promised to be a dramatic conclusion. Jennifer Walsh was escorted to the witness stand by court bailiffs, her appearance a stark contrast to the confident professional who had begun testifying just days earlier. The weight of her deceptions and the mounting evidence against her had taken a visible toll. Her face was pale and drawn, her hands shook uncontrollably, and her eyes darted nervously around the courtroom as if seeking an escape that didn't exist. Coleman sat at the prosecution table in virtual isolation, his staff having quietly distanced themselves as the investigation into his misconduct had intensified overnight. The ambitious prosecutor, who had seen this case as a stepping stone to higher office, now faced the very real possibility of criminal charges and professional disgrace. His career, built on a foundation of convictions and political positioning, lay in ruins around him. Rex took his customary position beside the defendant's table, but his demeanor was different from previous days. The German Shepherd seemed to sense that the moment of truth had finally arrived. His amber eyes were alert and focused, his posture attentive but calm. Throughout the trial, he had served as an unlikely guardian of truth, and now his vigil was nearing its end. Judge Reynolds addressed the courtroom with unusual solemnity, acknowledging the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them to this point. She announced that the investigation into prosecutorial misconduct had yielded significant findings that would be addressed. But first, she wanted to provide Jennifer Walsh with one final opportunity to tell the truth about her involvement in the case. Sarah Mitchell approached the witness stand with the confidence of an attorney who knew that justice was finally within reach. Her questions were direct and uncompromising, designed to strip away the last vestiges of Jennifer's elaborate deception. The defense attorney's voice carried the authority of someone who held all the cards and was prepared to play them. Jennifer's responses were halting and contradictory, her earlier rehearsed answers completely abandoned under the weight of overwhelming evidence. As Sarah methodically presented each piece of evidence that contradicted her testimony, Jennifer's composure continued to deteriorate. Her voice became barely audible, her breathing shallow and rapid, and perspiration beaded on her forehead despite the courtroom's controlled temperature. The breakthrough came when Sarah presented the final piece of evidence, a recording of a phone conversation between Jennifer and Coleman that had been discovered during the overnight investigation. The recording, captured by surveillance equipment during a visit to the prosecutor's office, revealed the two of them discussing how to fabricate evidence and coordinate Jennifer's testimony to ensure Michael's conviction. The impact of the recording was immediate and devastating. Jennifer's voice on the tape was clear and unmistakable as she discussed the best ways to present false information to make it appear credible. Coleman's responses revealed his active participation in the scheme, including his suggestions for manufacturing documents and coaching Jennifer on how to appear sympathetic to the jury. As the recording played, Rex rose from his position and walked slowly toward the witness stand. The German Shepherd's movement was deliberate and purposeful, his trained instincts responding to the extreme emotional distress emanating from Jennifer as her world collapsed around her. He stopped directly in front of the witness stand and sat down, his unwavering gaze fixed on the woman who had built her testimony on a foundation of lies. Jennifer's breaking point had finally arrived. The combination of overwhelming evidence, the damning recording, and Rex's intense, knowing stare proved too much for her to endure. Her carefully constructed facade crumbled completely as she began to sob uncontrollably, her body shaking with the release of weeks of accumulated stress and guilt. Through her tears, Jennifer began to speak, her words tumbling out in a rush of confession and desperation. She admitted that everything in her testimony had been fabricated, that Michael Thompson had never asked her to do anything improper, and that she had been the one responsible for the financial irregularities at Lincoln Elementary School. Her voice was choked with emotion as she revealed how she had embezzled the money to pay off her crushing debts and support her gambling addiction. The courtroom was silent, except for Jennifer's sobbing voice as she continued her confession. She described how Coleman had approached her after the irregularities were discovered, offering her immunity and financial compensation in exchange for her testimony against Michael. The prosecutor had convinced her that sacrificing an innocent man was a small price to pay for avoiding prison and financial ruin. Jennifer's admission revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. She had not only stolen the money, but had also helped Coleman fabricate evidence, create false documents, and develop a narrative that would ensure Michael's conviction. The immunity agreement wasn't just protection from prosecution, it was payment for perjury and conspiracy to commit fraud. The jury listened in stunned silence as Jennifer described how Rex's presence had unnerved her from the very beginning. She admitted that the German Shepherd seemed to see through her deception in a way that human observers couldn't, and that his consistent reactions had gradually worn down her ability to maintain the lie. The dog's training as an emotional support animal had made him exquisitely sensitive to stress and deception, turning him into an unlikely but effective truth detector. Coleman made one final desperate attempt to salvage the situation, jumping to his feet and attempting to discredit Jennifer's confession as the desperate lies of a woman facing inevitable prosecution. However, his words rang hollow in the face of the recorded evidence and the mountain of documentation that supported Jennifer's new version of events. Judge Reynolds silenced him with a stern look that promised severe consequences for his role in the conspiracy. Rex remained seated in front of the witness stand throughout Jennifer's confession, his presence providing a strange kind of comfort to the woman who was finally unburdening herself of months of deception. The German Shepherd's calm demeanor seemed to encourage her continued honesty, as if his unwavering attention was helping her find the strength to tell the complete truth. As Jennifer's confession concluded, the full scope of Michael Thompson's innocence became clear to everyone in the courtroom. He had been the victim of an elaborate frame-up designed to cover Jennifer's embezzlement and advance Coleman's career. The man who had been portrayed as a greedy criminal was revealed to be a hard-working community member who had been targeted because of his trusting nature and his position as project foreman. Judge Reynolds called for an immediate recess to process the extraordinary developments and consult with law enforcement about the criminal charges that would need to be filed against both Jennifer and Coleman. As the courtroom emptied, Michael Thompson finally allowed himself to show emotion, tears streaming down his face as he embraced his wife and children who had stood by him throughout the ordeal. Rex approached Michael and gently nuzzled his hand. The German Shepherd's job finally complete. The remarkable animal had proven that truth has a way of revealing itself, even in the most complex and deceptive circumstances. His presence had transformed a routine fraud trial into a landmark case that would be remembered for decades to come. The aftermath moved swiftly. All charges against Michael Thompson were dropped, and he received a formal apology from the court and the community. Jennifer Walsh was arrested on charges of embezzlement, perjury, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Coleman faced even more serious charges, including prosecutorial misconduct, bribery, and obstruction of justice. Both would eventually serve significant prison sentences for their crimes. The story of Michael Thompson and Rex became a legend in Burlington and beyond, a testament to the power of truth and the remarkable bond between humans and animals. Rex's ability to detect deception had not only saved an innocent man, but had also exposed corruption at the highest levels of the local justice system. As Michael walked out of the courthouse, a free man, Rex trotting proudly beside him, the community that had once doubted him now celebrated his vindication. The German Shepherd had proven that sometimes the most unlikely heroes can emerge in the darkest moments, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, ultimately prevails. Dear viewers, we hope Michael and Rex's incredible story of truth triumphing over deception has moved you as much as it moved us. This remarkable tale of an unlikely partnership between man and dog proves that justice can come from the most unexpected places. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Share your thoughts in the comments below about how animals have shown wisdom in your own life. Every day, we bring you unique stories that explore the depths of human nature and the extraordinary bonds we share with our animal companions. Don't miss our upcoming stories of courage, redemption, and the power of truth. We look forward to hearing from you in the comments section below.